computer. Here we go. Okay, YouTubers, thank you so much for joining me at My Life as a Landlord. I hope you learned something today. Got a great guest. I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Welcome to My Life as a Landlord. This is Dr. Jen. Super happy to have you today. This is episode number 49, and I have got an amazing guest today. After all, my podcast aims to educate U.S. and Canadian landlords and tenants who seek calm success. Calm success, that's my buzzword. I appreciate that. I provide a predictable rotating 3 topics, helping landlords, tenants, and then other Salisbury adventures. What today's an other Salisbury adventure. And whenever possible, I invite experts to join me. And that's what's going on today. I've got amazing guest, Colin Grabow. I'm so happy to have you, Colin. Thanks for joining us from the East Coast of the U.S.
Well, Jen, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah. So Colin and I met at a Hawaii Grassroots Institute meeting about the Jones Act. And we're going to talk all about the Jones Act today. And Colin is the guy to talk to. And I'm so excited about that. Thank you again for joining us. So, Colin, just what is the Jones Act?
Yeah, first things first. What is this thing we're going to talk about? So the Jones Act is it's Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And what it says is that if you want to move something, so you want to transport goods by water within the United States, you have to use a vessel that meets 4 conditions. The vessel has to be flagged and registered here in the United States, just like you register your car in a state, you have to register your ship in the United States. It has to be built in the United States. It has to be crewed by Americans, and it has to be at least 75% owned by Americans.
That seems like a really, really tall order to do.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, they hear that and they think, well, that sounds like a great law. What's so bad about Americans, American-built ships crewed by Americans, owned by Americans, transporting goods? And the problem is that these vessels are incredibly expensive and they drive up the cost of everything that they transport.
Oh my goodness. Well, because I'm sitting on Maui, we're going to talk all about Hawaii here shortly. This is one of the reasons why I attended your lecture, is because, Mike and I bring in all kinds of goods to Hawaii to support housing. And, but I don't want to leave out Canada, because I've got quite a listenership for my Canadian landlords and tenants up there as well. How does the Jones Act impact Canadians? Because it sounds like it's mostly US.
Well, we wouldn't have the Jones Act without Canada. Canada figures pretty prominently here, actually. So, I mentioned the Jones Act was passed in 1920, but we've had laws very similar to the Jones Act with similar requirements going back almost to the founding of the country. And back at that time, back in the late 1700s, the U.S. Being forced to use a U.S. built or U.S. crewed ship was no big imposition, because we had some of the best shipbuilders in the world, most efficient. And this is back in the days of wooden ships and sails. And so there was really no big premium to be paid to use a U.S. ship, and it wasn't that advantageous to use a foreign one. But as time went on, that changed. And these protected U.S. industries, the shipbuilders and the shipping companies, they started to become less and less competitive. And by about 1860, 1870, U.S. built ships were, they were not competitive with those built abroad. And people started looking for ways around the Jones Act. How can, where are some loopholes? And so it said, well, okay, I can't use a foreign ship to go between U.S. ports, but what if I go to a foreign port and then back to a U.S. port? And somebody tried that, transporting 250 kegs of nails. And the government said, yeah, no, that works. The courts ruled, rather, yes, that's permissible. So Congress changed law and said, no, you can't do that. So people still look for loopholes. And one loophole they found was transporting goods to and from Alaska, between Alaska and the lower 48. And while you couldn't send a foreign ship from one U.S. port to another, what you could do is transport goods over land to a foreign port and then use a foreign ship from that foreign port to an American port. So people would send goods to and from Alaska through Vancouver. They would go over land to Vancouver and then get loaded and go to and from Alaska. Well, who hated that? Well, shipping companies based in Seattle. They said, this is unfair Canadian competition. That should be our business. And these shipping companies were represented in Congress by Senator Wesley Jones of Washington State. who had a house in Seattle. And they testified in Congress in 1920 and said, "Hey, we got this problem with unfair competition. We think you should change the law. Here's some suggested tweaks." And if you look at the language of the Jones Act today, it almost exactly mirrors what was proposed by these shipping companies in Washington State, and that's how we got the Jones Act.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Colin, you know that I've got rental business in Canada as well. In fact, it's in British Columbia, north of Vancouver. And we see the cruise ships go by often. And yes, we know there are cruise ships that go out of Seattle and there's cruise ships that go out of Vancouver, but they're subject to stuff with the Jones Act too, right?
They're subject to a very similar law. You can call it maybe the Jones Act's twin brother or close cousin, called the Passenger Vessel Services Act. And the Passenger Vessel Service Act, it's basically the same as the Jones Act, except it applies to transportation of people instead of stuff. So ferries and cruise ships, these are subject to the PVSA. And the way these cruise ships operate that go up to Alaska from Seattle is to avoid violating the PVSA. They have to stop in a foreign port and make that voyage international, not purely domestic. So they will go up and stop in, Victoria or Vancouver for I think about 4 hours, check that box, go, "Hi, we went to a foreign country. This is an international voyage, and it's all kosher." But there was an issue a couple of years ago during COVID where Canada shut out its ports to cruise ships. There were concerns that we don't. Last thing we want is a cruise ship full of people with COVID showing up in our ports. Well, this put these cruise companies in a pickle, because how are they going to be able to go back and forth if they can't make that stop in Canada? So the Alaska delegation got a bill passed through Congress that gave an exemption to the PVSA just for a few months for that cruise season, because something like 60% of all Alaska tourist revenue are these cruise ships. And there's a cruise season. If they would have missed it, it would have been a real big deal. But that has lapsed, and now we're back to the days of stopping in Canada just to check that box. It works out, I guess, for the Canadians. They get extra people stopping by, but not so great for Alaska.
Now, what about let's keep talking about cruise ships. Mike and I like to
Yeah.
cruise, and we honeymooned around the state of Hawaii on a Norwegian cruise line ship called the Pride of America. Now, that goes to the islands in Hawaii and doesn't make another stop somewhere else to make it international. How did they get away with that?
Yeah, it is the only large cruise ship in the world that complies with the PVSA. But even then, there's a big asterisk there, because this ship got a special exemption because it wasn't actually built in the United States, or I should say, it wasn't fully built in the United States. The backstory to this is that there was a company trying to build a couple of cruise ships back in, I think, the late 90s or so, and the company went bankrupt. So the shipyard building these ships had the half-built one ship. It had the parts for another ship. It didn't know what to do with them, and so it sold them to a German shipyard, which took the ships and finished them. And then after they were built, there were no ships operating in Hawaii. So there was a push by the Hawaii delegation to give a special exemption to this one ship, which is now the Pride of America, so it can operate in Hawaii. And this is a big advantage, because if it didn't have that, all the other cruise ships that come to Hawaii, if they come, say, from California, well, they, just like those ships going up to Alaska, they need to stop in a foreign port. So they'll go back to the West Coast, but they'll stop in Mexico, in Ensenada, Mexico, just south of San Diego, stop there for a few hours, check the box, and then go return to California.
That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing when you just, like you say, everybody's looking for the loopholes. But we talked a little bit about Hawaii, but I know there are other geographic areas that are impacted by the Jones Act, especially after the Jones Act is, 100 years old and counting. What other areas are impacted?
Yeah, so I mean, the entire United States is impacted, but here in the mainland, we have ways around it. I can use a truck, I can use rail. We have alternatives to transporting goods. It still hurts. It would be nice to have efficient shipping, but there are workarounds. But it's much more impactful, of course, for folks in the non-contiguous states and territories. Obviously, Hawaii, obviously Alaska. Already talked about that, but also Puerto Rico, which is U.S. territory, and also Guam. Guam has a special status where they're nominally exempt from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act. So you can use a foreign built ship, but you still need an American flag. But on a de facto basis, well, anybody going to Guam is going to want to stop in Hawaii on the way. Makes no sense just to go to Guam and pass by the much larger market. So a lot of the ships that go to Guam are Jones Act ships that first go to Hawaii. So on a de facto basis, Guam is impacted just as much as the other area non-contiguous states and territories.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's I know you're doing incredible research there in Washington, D.C. at the Cato Institute on the Jones Act and how it impacts and you know your education is all about international affairs and trading and things like that. And I'm wondering what's your take on the Jones Act impacting the housing crisis in North America? How do you see the Jones Act affecting the housing crisis?
Yeah, so obviously you're constructing a house, you need lots of different materials. Um, and in the case, say of Hawaii, well, you're going to feel it particularly because all that stuff has to be transported by ship. And I don't think we've really explored it, but these Jones Act ships are very expensive for two reasons. One is the cost of operating them is roughly three times more than ones from the international fleet. And then also they have to be built in the United States, and US built ships are 4 to 5 times more expensive than those built abroad. So, for example, the latest Jones Act ship built, in fact, the only Jones Act ship built this year, which is for the Hawaii trade to be used by Pasha, Hawaii, it costs over $225 million. Now, a similar size ship was ordered from a South Korean shipyard 2 years ago, I think, for like $41 million. So
Whoa,
who's paying that difference? What's
I
going to get
am.
people to have to use Jones Act shipping?
I am.
Exactly. Everyone in Hawaii. And obviously everyone in Alaska and everywhere else. But with regard to the housing market specifically, say for example, we have this situation where lumber producers in the northwest of the United States have been complaining about the Jones Act for years because they say, look, when I want to send my lumber to other parts of the United States, I have to use Jones Act shipping, or I have to put on a railroad. I don't have access to efficient shipping, but my competitors across the board in Canada, they can use international ships,
Mm.
and that gives them a leg up. Kind of tilts the playing field in their direction, puts a thumb on the scale for them. So that's unfair. But this applies to all kinds of building materials. I can also think of another example. The Wall Street Journal a few years ago had a story about the Jones Act, and it mentioned a guy that ran a lumber store, I think, in Maine. He said, "Look, I got customers down in Puerto Rico, and if I want to get it to them, well, there are no Jones Act ships that operate, say, out of Boston or Kennebunkport, any Portland, Maine, or one of these closer ports. I have to get everything to Jacksonville, Florida first, because that's where 90% of the shipping going to Puerto Rico operates out of. So first I got to pay the cost to, get it down there. And then from there, I got to put on an expensive Jones Act vessel. So, we know that, theoretically without the Jones Act, say people in the Southeast United States could get cheaper access to lumber. Talking about this lumber thing, the Jones Act creates some interesting bedfellows because obviously the U.S. shipping companies, they don't want the competition. They love the Jones Act. But I remember that some decades ago, when people in the Northwest were trying to get something done on the Jones Act, they also found opposition from lumber companies in the Southeast United States because they didn't want the competition either. They thought, hey, this helps keep out competitors from other parts of the U.S. So
Oh,
yeah, it has all kinds of dysfunctional, strange
oh
outcomes.
my goodness. Well, it just shows you that you never know if you drop a pebble in a pond, you never know how those waves are going to impact. And, the housing crisis is global and it just it's amazing what impacts are different where. I mean, the housing crisis in our location up in Paul River, BC, we don't talk about the Jones Act, but we do talk about because it's two ferries to get up there and everything has to be barged in, much like Maui. And but when we're talking about from everything from Long Beach or from Seattle to Maui, for all that's got to go on a Jones Act. Plus, there's a lot more logistical aspects from that. So it all impacts the bottom line, which then, okay, the cost of housing goes up, 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 and which ties right into rebuilding Lahaina. The fires that took out Lahaina and 19 houses up country on August 8th of 2023. Now we've got this whole big rebuild push going on, which hasn't started yet, but that's immediately what I thought is how are we going to get all the materials here and not go broke to rebuild Lahaina? I mean, what's your take on the Jones Act rebuilding Lahaina? It's going to be expensive.
Yeah, yeah. So to your point, I mean, basically, the Jones Act affects the cost of transportation, and transportation affects everything. I mean, it touches almost all aspects of our economy. So yeah, the ripples are felt everywhere, but especially in say Maui, because Maui is arguably an added disadvantage in the sense that any goods coming from the mainland, and of course, the mainland is Hawaii's biggest trading partner. It's part of the same country. It's going to go to Honolulu first on a ship, but then it has to get transferred to a barge to go to Maui. So it has to use two Jones Act vessels. So double the fun. And I mentioned the cost of ships, but even the barges are expensive. I think the main barge being used to transport goods to Maui is the help me with the pronunciation, Haleakala.
I think that's right. It's Young Brothers.
Yeah,
Yeah, Young
yeah,
Brothers was the
exactly.
inner island.
It's I think it's a Matson barge, and it costs $25 million to build. Well, to give you some perspective, it holds the cargo capacity is I think 640 TEUs. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. So a 20-foot container is one TEU. You have a 40-foot container, that's two TEUs. Well, this thing is 640 TEUs. Well, you could buy an actual self-propelled ocean-going ship, and not a barge, but a self-propelled ship overseas for something like $23 million for 1,000 TEUs with a bigger cargo capacity. So again, this speaks to, and of course, that's going to be a little bit more efficient, being self-propelled, going through the ocean than relying on a barge. So yeah, everything. You can think of the Jones Act as a tax, basically. It's like a transportation tax. And then that's going to be particularly felt, it's felt in Oahu, but then it's particularly felt in the neighbor islands that also have to rely on that feeder service, the barges coming out of Honolulu. So yeah, everything, all the rebuilding supplies that have to go there from the mainland are all going to pay that Jones Act tax.
Yeah. Well, I'm just I know that's not the only thing that we pay for when we're bringing stuff in, and we'll talk about protectionism and all that here in a second. But if I remember from your lecture, Jones Act fleet is about 100 vessels. Is that right? Do I have it right?
Yeah, so if you look at just strictly ships, ocean going, a container ship, a tanker, things like that. As of April, which is the most latest statistics the government provides, there were 93 Jones Act ships.
So
There are,
93.
many more, say, river barges and tugboats and things like that. But when you talk actual ships, yes, we're looking at less than 100 in the Jones Act fleet.
That's incredible. I mean, I don't know what, the 93 ships are split, West Coast, East Coast, anything like that. But when you're supplying materials, I mean, millions of people live in all these different places that rely on this. That's not a lot. Like,
Well, you
that's
think
not a
about,
lot at
yeah,
all.
yeah, I think globally, it depends how you define what a ship is, but there's roughly something like 50,000 ships in the world, and there are 93 that comply with the Jones Act. So that means that for Americans, which we are the world's largest economy, but also we're a geographically just very large country. This is a country that stretches, from Guam to Puerto Rico, from the Aleutian Islands to Maine. Transportation is a big deal. And we only have a fraction of 1% of the world's ships to meet our economic needs. That those 93 ships, you mentioned you don't know how they break down East Coast, West Coast. Well, 56 of those are tankers. So then you're talking just in terms of cargo ships that can handle dry goods. Cargo ships, I think there's something like 23, something like that. Again, to meet the needs of the world's largest economy. And it's interesting that these ships are restricted all the container ships, 100% of them operate to the non-contiguous states and territories. You can't take a container ship, say, from Boston to Houston. There aren't any because they're not competitive. That option does not exist. We only use Jones Act ships where there's no other choice. And I think that's pretty instructive because, shipping is typically known, especially over long distances, as being a very efficient, attractive means of transportation. And we've made it pretty much a last resort.
Wow. And expensive. I mean, we only build one Jones Act ship. Why do we not build more ships in the US? We're busy building other stuff, probably military ships.
Yeah, a couple of reasons. Yeah, so we don't build very many ships. So, the idea behind the Jones Act is, well, you require the ships to be built here in the U.S. That means that people will build lots of ships and keep our shipyards busy. But our shipyards are so uncompetitive and charge such high prices, there isn't much demand for what they make. In fact, literally this
Mm.
week, I saw an article from Lloyd's of London talking to the CEO of a major Jones Act tanker company. He said, "Yeah, I'm not buying any new ships. I'm just going to take my older ones and put like new engines in them and try to upgrade
Mm.
them because U.S. built tanker is 200 million dollars. Overseas, it's $50 million. So people are very reluctant to buy new ships faced with those prices. So there isn't much demand. And as far as why that is, I mean, there's a few reasons. You kind of hinted at one, which is what's really keeping shipbuilding going in this country are military contracts.
Mm.
Almost as of 2019, something like 78, 79% of all shipbuilding revenue in this country, industry revenue, was from U.S. government contracts. It's not private sector.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, you look at the big shipyards in this country: Newport News, Electric Boat, Bath Iron Works, Huntington Ingalls. It's government contracts. A lot of these shipyards, they haven't built a commercial ship in decades. And then as far as why we're so bad at it, well, a few reasons. Number one, I think if you protect an industry from competition, they're going to be uncompetitive almost by definition. You have to compete. You're not going to be competitive. Number two, U.S. shipyards are kind of jack of all trades, master of none. It's a small captive market. So one year they build this kind of vessel, another they build another kind of vessel. Where shipyards overseas will build large volumes of vessels, but in a pretty narrow category for the international market. So they specialize, they get pretty good at a certain type of vessel that Americans are disincentivized from specializing. So we don't become as competitive. We're kind of all over the place in what they do, and the prices they charge reflect that.
Well, let's talk more about prices. I know we had talked about the costs of shipping, and a Jones Act is, one thing driving up the costs, but that's not the only thing, right? You had talked about protectionism and recently wrote a blog about it. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, this blog post, which I wrote shortly after the disaster that struck Maui with the wildfires. So obviously, as we've discussed at length, anything coming in from the mainland is going to pay that Jones Act tax. So then you may think, well, the Jones Act does not apply to international shipping. You can bring in, imported goods from abroad and use any ship you want. So that provides, say, a refuge from the Jones Act. But even if you do that, you're still going to get hit by another set of protectionist policies, which are, your run-of-the-mill tariffs, for example. We put tariffs on all kinds of building supplies like hardwood, plywood, and quartz counters,
Mm-hmm.
nails. We have, and we talked about the importance of wood as an input, as a material for building homes. Well, there's also steel and aluminum. That's a big material that's needed for construction. And we have the Trump administration imposed special tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, which the Biden administration has kept in place.
Mm.
So all kinds of things, wall tiles, ceramic roofing tiles,
Mm-hmm.
copper nails, you name it. There's probably some kind of tax that's being applied to that, which drives up the cost in the case of Maui of reconstruction, rebuilding.
Mike and I saw that. When we were doing our recent build, we on Maui, we had mainland stuff that was coming in, subject to the Jones Act, and then we had international stuff that we had built, manufactured, and then shipped in from Asia. Right, some of it was China, but not all of it was China, and there were tariffs and all kinds of things that were charged on top of that going to Honolulu, and then of course it has to be transferred to a Jones Act barge to get to Maui. I mean, it's all over the place in Hawaii and beyond. Anything
Jim,
else?
let me interrupt you.
Yeah, yeah.
For your Canadian listeners, they may be screaming at me right now because I left out softwood tariffs on softwood lumber
Oh,
exports from Canada. We hit the Canadians with special tariffs. And these aren't just your run of the mill tariffs. We said, oh, this is unfair competition from Canada, so we've artificially inflated the price of their lumber exports. So that's also playing a helping hand in the reconstruction, no doubt.
and it's interesting because here on Maui, one of the main lumber suppliers here on Maui is bought by or was bought or the same ownership has a mill in Canada. So when all that went down, so then it was tariffs into the US and then Jones Act to get it to Maui. And so lumber prices, everybody wanted to know why lumber prices spiked during COVID. And of course, during our build, it spiked. Well, it was no question for Mike and I on why that all happened. So absolutely. Anything else for the Canadian listeners?
Yeah, I will tell the Canadians may find this story kind of amusing. Last year, there was a story that came out about, there's a special little known exemption to the Jones Act, which says that you can use a foreign vessel if at some point during the voyage, during the cargo's journey, it goes over a Canadian railway. And there's an obscure backstory of that I won't bore you with. But so, here in the East Coast, we like to import frozen fish from Alaska. And the way that typically works is it gets loaded onto Jones Act ships from Dutch Harbor. They'll go to Seattle, offload, gets placed on a rail, and goes to the East Coast. Well, another company had an idea and they said, well, what if we could use foreign ships on a Canadian railway? So what they did is they loaded the frozen fish onto a foreign ship and went down through the Panama Canal, up the West Coast, and went to New Brunswick, Canada. They offloaded it, and this company built a 200-foot long railway. They loaded the frozen fish on the railway, would go up and down. They check that box and say, we want a Canadian railway. Then they load them onto trucks and send them across the border into the United States. Now, 2 years ago, Customs and Border Protection busted this and said, no, that is not a Canadian railway. That does not count. They tried fining these guys hundreds of millions of dollars and shut the whole operation down. But this speaks to a larger point. These are the links that people will go to get around the Jones Act. This company obviously did the math and thought, it makes more sense for us to build a fake railway in New Brunswick and do all this rigmarole than just use a Jones Act ship and go to Seattle and send it on a train. And I think that's instructive.
Well, I think it's amazing. Capitalism, trying to make a business case for all of that is super interesting. Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, Colin, as we close out today's podcast, the last thing I always do for my guests is I give them a call to action. And so all you listeners out there, I'm going to put the link to Colin's blog post about protectionism on the website on mylifeasalandlord.com. So your call to action today is go and read it. Go and read it. Learn more about what Colin's doing with the Jones Act. It does affect you especially you landlords, whether you're on the US side or the Canadian side. At some point in your landlord journey, you're going to have to do some kind of renovation or upgrade, and very likely you're going to have an impact with materials and maybe resulting labor because of some of this stuff. So thank you so much, Colin, for joining us today. This has been great having you. Appreciate it.
Well, Jen, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk to you and your listeners. Yeah, I hope they read the blog post and get something out of today's conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it.
Excellent. I'm so happy. I hope you come out to Maui again soon. Are you coming out to Hawaii anytime soon? Don't know.
I have no plans, but I'd love to. The day I saw you in Maui, that's the only time I've been to Maui, and I was only there for a few hours. I got off the airplane, went and gave a little talk, met you, got back on an airplane, and flew back to the mainland, and that was my whole Maui experience. So yeah, I'd love to get back.
Well, there is more to see on Maui, just so you're aware.
I've heard, yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, perfect. Well, as we close out, listeners, let me know your comments and questions. You can email me, learn@mylifeasalandlord.com. And of course, your comments and questions create our next podcast and give you more resources. Don't forget that we have free resources on our website, mylifeasalandlord.com, including 2 free blackout bingo cards for newbie and pickle landlords. Thanks again to Colin. Join me again next week, all you listeners out there. It's a podcast topic for landlords, episode number 50, and it's entitled The Art of Checking References. We'll see you there. Thank you, Colin. This
Thanks
was
so
so
much for having me. I'm glad we
much
were
fun.
able to make this happen. Yeah, yeah. It's good to catch up. It's been a while, and yeah, I was glad to get the update on how things are going in Maui. It's faded from the headlines here. You don't hear anything about it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
Luke is the interim CFO for Maui United Way, and so he's back in North Carolina then through the holidays. So he'll be back on Maui in January, and he is an incredible resource and knowledge. And I love that he was automatically thinking, "Oh, we're in a disaster situation. How does that affect the Jones Act?" And I mean, that's the kind of guy he is. He's got his doctorate. He's got his PhD. I have an EDD, but he's got a PhD, and he was in the Coast Guard, and he's going to tell you he was in the Coast Guard.
oh, good. Okay, great. Awesome.
All right. Well, I will let you go. I know it's getting late there. It's almost, what are we at, 5 o'clock?
Almost five.
Almost five.
Yeah, it's
Well,
almost quitting time.
go home and have a great dinner. And again, so you're okay if I don't send you the link, or do you want to see the YouTube
Yeah,
link?
no, I trust you. No, I'm not, and no, I'm not going to
You don't
request it.
care.
If it looks good to you, then I'm sure I'm fine with it.
It's going to be
I don't
perfect.
think you're out to get me or make me look bad, so I'm not
Oh,
worried about it.
course not. Well, I would love to have you back on the show, maybe in 6 months or a year from now, and see how things have changed, especially if something comes up and Luke does spur some
Yeah,
conversation about the disaster aspect of it, and say maybe there's a loophole there, right? That would be
yeah.
interesting.
No, I look, well, I mean, gosh, we go down a whole nother rabbit hole. The sad thing is, last year after another hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and there was a whole situation where there was a Jones Act waiver given because a tanker was going from Texas to the Netherlands with like 300,000 barrels of diesel fuel. And the Puerto Ricans were like, hey, we need diesel fuel because we're all using generators here because our electrical system is down. So Biden issued a Jones Act waiver, but then all these maritime folks said, oh, that was illegal and the way he did it was wrong. So they further tightened the waiver requirements around the Jones Act to ensure that if that situation repeated itself, they would not be able to get access to that ship. It's an
Wow.
absolutely crazy thing. So we've actually made it in the last 5 years. Congress twice has moved to tighten waiver restrictions and make it more difficult. So basically, today, if like Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I don't think the president would have the authority to issue the waiver like Trump did in 2017. And if that tanker showed up again, just like Biden issued the waiver last year, that wouldn't be able to happen either under current laws. So yeah, it's gotten worse, unfortunately,
Wow.
because this stuff happens in the dead of night. This gets inserted into like the National Defense Authorization Act, which is 4,000 pages. No one knows what's in it. There's no debate or discussion of it, but some lobbyists just get a few paragraphs inserted in there, and that's all it takes. Like I talked to one member of Congress, or their staff rather, and they wanted to exempt Puerto Rico. They wanted Biden to exempt Puerto Rico from the Jones Act for a year. And I was like, you guys know that he doesn't have the authority to do that because Congress changed the law. And they're like, we did? We had no idea. And this just speaks to the fact that they're like, oh, it's in the NDAA. Oh, we always vote against the NDA. So, oh, thank God, we didn't vote for that. But they don't know, and you can't blame because again, it's 4,000. Who
4,000
reads all that?
pages.
So,
Right.
welcome, and this I'm talking about the Jones. I could be talking about any number of things. This is how things work or don't work. So,
Wow.
anyway, sorry to go down that rabbit hole, but
No,
yeah,
but this is exactly why it would be great to have you back on the show, in 2024 sometime, because stuff is changing constantly and updating
yeah,
constantly.
yeah,
And yeah, I would love to get an update from you. And, honestly, I look back in my email history, you and I've emailed back and forth about once a quarter about something that's happened, because I'll get updates or articles or something from somewhere, and I'll go, hey, Colin, you need to know this is going on in Hawaii or on Maui. And just to keep you appraised of what's happening locally here. So,
yeah. I appreciate you being my eyes and ears out there.
yeah, no, and you know what? I'm really excited to connect you with Luke. That's really great. So,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation. Yeah,
yeah,
looking
no,
forward to
that'll
hearing
be
back
very
from him.
lively. He's a absolute firecracker. He is on it. So, and he's just a super intelligent guy. So, awesome.
Awesome.
Well, have a great night. Thank you so much again for
Okay,
your time.
yeah, probably won't see you anytime soon. So have a great Thanksgiving.
And to you, appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Bye.